So yesterday I was seeing a LinkedIn post where somebody wrote about how Kubernetes removed Docker from its underlying layer and the whole infrastructure somehow magically still works and nobody felt any tremors. So most of you might not know how exactly the Docker works in terms of containerization. Why? Because till this point, or maybe beyond this, Docker was made up like an analogical name or an analogy of containers, similar to what we see in cases of surf for detergent and mobile for lubricants, right? So Docker does not means containerization or containers. Docker is a tool for containerization or making containers, similar to Surf was never detergent. Surf was a company selling detergent and it was so uncompetitive in its niche that somehow people ended up making an analogy that surf itself means detergent, similar to Mobil was never lubricant. Mobil was a brand selling lubricants, but I don't see more than 1% of people knowing this fact that Mobil is a company selling lubricants and not a lubricant itself. So, cutting the crap, that's a different debate. So, exactly the same way, Docker gives or act as a tool to make containers or containerization possible. Now, how Kubernetes achieved this thing without Docker lies in the core principle of how a container is basically made. To understand container, you can simply assume it as a small virtual computers independent in its file system. Not, I would say file system is however mounted from outside, which is of the base machine. In terms of dependencies, in terms of library files, shared folders and everything else which is required by that particular code or code snippet to run it, independently. So if we drill down this thing into a simpler problem, how it can be achieved, if you say, let's say if you have a small code which is itself executable, okay, you have, let's say, the dependencies available, or even if it is not available but you know the places where it can be found, what is the main thing you are left with to make it work? That is a runtime, right? So this is how Docker basically containerized the codes or containerized the applications by providing the runtime, and that was done using a specific set of software called Container D. Now, what Container D is, so Container D basically prepares the whole code, the whole dependencies, libraries, shared things, and mounting the file systems, everything. It made it ready for the code and the Docker file, everything, so that the app can be executed and the runtime can be provided for that particular code snippet. Now, again, let's imagine if we remove or call the container D by bypassing the Docker system or the Docker call, it can be easily done, right? So there was no actual dependency on the Docker itself for the apps or the codes to be containerized. Docker was providing basically a way to container D, and again there is a still a drill down to it. So container D also does not do all the work itself. So container D calls a sub process or a sub software, or I would say sub program called runc. So now the runc basically provides the actual runtime, actual specifications using the Linux kernels to make the containerization possible. So if you can anyhow call or pull out the container D and runc softwares out of in getting yourself involved into Docker, you can achieve the same thing, right? So this is what Kubernetes has done. So what Kubernetes did is they stopped calling the Docker, which they eventually or essentially needed it for the container C and run D. Sorry, container D and run C. So, okay, so they called it explicitly out of the Docker environment, Docker system. Okay. Now again, one more question can arise from here. What about the Docker file? So there is still a dependency on the Docker, right? But that dependency was long back gone, okay, because Docker file or a Docker file is just a set of commands or a kind of a template to let know the processes how to, or not how exactly, yeah, how to make the container and what parameters should be passed on to while making the containers and what specification exactly the container needs to have it. So that can specifically done with simple other uh, mechanisms as well. For example, I'm not using Docker file for my pipelines. I'm just using gradle.settings and I'm adding code lines in the settings.gradle and build.gradle, and that works as a Docker file without having any Docker file in itself, right? So the Docker file dependency was long back gone. The only two dependencies which was left was container D and runc, which the Kubernetes is calling explicitly, directly using the kubelet communication process. So now once you have the Docker file eliminated, if you can construct a Docker file, replicate the Docker file without actually having the Docker file, that is checked. Then you have the container D, which basically gathers all the information before the runtime can be attached to it or provided to the code. And then you have the runc, which is actually giving you the runtime. So yeah, this is how Kubernetes eliminated or de-scraped the whole Docker infra from its underlying layer, and everything is still working because they are just calling the wholesaler without going through, any kind of middleman. So yeah, I hope now you know a better picture.